Joseph, as one of Jesus' disciples, if you've ever wondered what it means to truly follow Jesus, you're not alone. Throughout history, countless people have asked what it looks like to live a life of faith and surrender. Today, we're going to explore a unique perspective by looking at someone whose connection to Jesus runs deeper than most Joseph. But before we dive in, it's important to clarify which Joseph we're talking about. The Bible introduces us to several significant figures named Joseph. First, there's Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy man who provided his own tomb for Jesus' burial, Matthew 27:57-60. Then there's Joseph, the son of Jacob, famously known for his coat of many colors and his journey from slavery to prominence in Egypt, Genesis 37-50. But today, we're focusing on Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, a man whose quiet faithfulness speaks volumes about what it means to be a true disciple. Joseph isn't listed among the 12 disciples, but his role in Jesus' life reveals powerful lessons for all followers of Christ. Imagine Joseph walking alongside Peter, James, and John, each with their unique traits. While Peter was bold and passionate, and John was filled with love and compassion, Joseph would have brought a steady, humble presence. His quiet strength and unwavering trust in God reflected the heart of a true disciple. Joseph's story begins with a remarkable act of faith. When he discovered Mary was pregnant, he faced a difficult choice. By law, Joseph could have exposed her to public shame, but instead, he sought to protect her. In Matthew 1:20-21, an angel appeared to Joseph in a dream, revealing God's plan. Joseph obeyed without question, choosing to embrace God's will even when it defied human logic. That kind of obedience is central to discipleship, trusting God when circumstances don't make sense. Joseph's faith was not a one-time decision, it shaped his entire life. When warned in a dream to flee to Egypt to protect the infant Jesus from Herod's wrath, Joseph immediately obeyed, Matthew 2:13-14. That journey required courage, sacrifice, and complete reliance on God's guidance. As a follower of Jesus, Joseph's example reminds us that discipleship often means stepping into the unknown, trusting God to lead the way. Joseph's role as a father to Jesus also reflects the heart of a disciple. He embraced his role with humility, content to serve behind the scenes. As a carpenter, Joseph worked quietly to provide for his family. He never sought recognition or fame. Instead, he faithfully fulfilled his calling in the background. This humility echoes Jesus' own teaching in Matthew 23:11. The greatest among you will be your servant. While Joseph may not have walked with Jesus during his public ministry, his life still embodies the core of discipleship. He listened for God's voice, obeyed even when the path was uncertain, and humbly fulfilled his role with unwavering faith. So, what can we learn from Joseph's example? First, discipleship begins with listening. Joseph paid attention when God spoke, and he acted without hesitation. We too must cultivate a heart that is sensitive to God's guidance, whether through His Word, His Spirit, or wise counsel. Second, discipleship requires obedience. Joseph stepped out in faith, leaving behind comfort and familiarity to follow God's leading. Sometimes following Jesus means trusting Him even when we can't see the full picture. Lastly, Joseph teaches us the power of humility. He embraced a life of quiet service, reminding us that true discipleship isn't about status or recognition, it's about faithfully pointing others to Jesus. If you've ever read the New Testament, you may have noticed that there are several men named Joseph. While each of them played an important role in God's plan, today we're going to focus on one in particular, Joseph of Arimathea. His story is brief yet powerful, and it reveals what it means to follow Jesus with courage, compassion, and unwavering faith. First, let's take a moment to distinguish the different Josephs in Scripture. One of the most well-known is Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, a righteous man who faithfully cared for Mary and Jesus. Then there's Joseph Barsabbas, also known as Justus, a follower of Jesus, who was considered as a candidate to replace Judas Iscariot after his betrayal and death, Acts 1:23. While Joseph Barsabbas wasn't chosen for that particular role, his presence reveals that he was a devoted follower of Christ. But the Joseph we're focusing on today is Joseph of Arimathea. The Gospels describe him as a wealthy man, a respected member of the Jewish council, and someone who secretly followed Jesus. His social standing and influence made him a prominent figure. Yet what makes Joseph truly remarkable is his courageous act of love and devotion. We first encountered Joseph of Arimathea in connection with Jesus' crucifixion. After Jesus breathed his last breath on the cross, Joseph went to Pilate and boldly requested permission to take Jesus' body and give him a proper burial, Matthew 27:57-58. This was no small risk. As a member of the Sanhedrin, the council that had played a role in condemning Jesus, Joseph's request could have jeopardized his reputation, social status, and even his safety. Yet Joseph was willing to risk it all because his love for Jesus outweighed his fear of man. Joseph's courage stands out because of the timing. Jesus had just been crucified a humiliating and agonizing death. The disciples were scattered, and many of Jesus' followers were overwhelmed with grief and fear. Yet Joseph stepped forward, honoring Jesus when so many others had lost hope. Joseph's actions fulfilled the prophecy in Isaiah 53:9, which foretold that the Messiah would be assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. By offering his own tomb, a costly and personal gift, Joseph ensured that Jesus' body was treated with dignity. This act of service demonstrated both his love for Jesus and his unwavering belief that Jesus was more than just a teacher, he was the promised Messiah. Joseph of Arimathea's story reminds us that following Jesus often requires courage. Sometimes it means standing up for our faith when others oppose us. It means stepping forward when it's easier to remain silent. Like Joseph, we may face moments where our devotion to Jesus calls us to take risks with our reputation, our comfort, or even our relationships. Yet God honors those who are faithful, just as Joseph's simple yet bold act became part of the powerful story of redemption. Joseph also teaches us the importance of compassion. When the world turned away from Jesus in his darkest hour, Joseph stepped in with tender care. As followers of Jesus today, we're called to reflect that same compassion, to care for the hurting, the outcast, and those the world has forgotten. Lastly, Joseph's story challenges us to give generously. He didn't hesitate to offer what he had: his wealth, his influence, and even his family tomb, because he knew Jesus was worth it. What might God be calling you to surrender today? Your time, your resources, your comfort. Whatever it may be, Joseph's example shows us that when we give freely in service to Christ, God uses our obedience in powerful ways. We now dig in on what it means to live out your faith in quiet yet powerful ways. The story of Joseph offers a remarkable example. Joseph wasn't one of Jesus' 12 disciples, but his devotion to Christ shone through in pivotal moments. Today, we'll explore Joseph's courageous loyalty, sacrificial love, and quiet discipleship qualities that make his faith unforgettable. First, let's look at Joseph's courageous loyalty. After Jesus' crucifixion, Joseph boldly approached Pontius Pilate and asked for Jesus' body, Mark 15:43. This was no small act. The crucifixion was a moment of fear and uncertainty. Jesus' followers were scattered, and associating with him came with serious risks. Yet Joseph stood firm. The Bible tells us Joseph was a prominent member of the council, meaning he held influence among the Jewish leaders. This group had largely opposed Jesus, which makes Joseph's actions even more remarkable. By stepping forward, Joseph risked his reputation, his standing in society, and possibly even his safety. Joseph's courage reminds us that true faith often requires boldness. Following Jesus may mean standing against popular opinion or risking rejection. Joseph's example challenges us to ask, are we willing to identify with Jesus even when it's costly? Next, we see Joseph's incredible example of sacrificial love. After securing Jesus' body, Joseph laid him in a tomb that Joseph himself owned, Matthew 27:57-60. In those days, tombs carved from rock were costly, typically reserved for the wealthy or noble families. Yet Joseph willingly gave up this space for Jesus. This was more than just an act of kindness. It was a profound expression of love and reverence for Christ. By giving up his own tomb, Joseph demonstrated that true discipleship requires giving generously, even when it demands personal sacrifice. Joseph's gift reminds us that following Jesus often involves giving up what is valuable to us, our time, resources, or comfort, to honor him and serve others. His actions echo Jesus' own words in John 15:13. "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." Finally, Joseph's quiet discipleship stands out. While some of Jesus' followers were vocal and visible, Joseph followed him in the background. In John 19:38, we learn that Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. For much of Jesus' ministry, Joseph kept his faith private. But when the moment demanded it most, when Jesus had been crucified and his closest followers had fled, Joseph stepped forward in obedience. His quiet faith became bold action at the perfect time. This reminds us that discipleship isn't always about public recognition. Sometimes the most powerful faith is expressed quietly through acts of kindness, quiet service, or steadfast loyalty in challenging moments. Joseph's story encourages us to be faithful wherever God has placed us, whether in the spotlight or in quiet obedience behind the scenes. Perhaps God is calling you to step out in boldness, to offer something precious in service to Him, or to remain faithful in the background until your moment to act arrives. Whatever it may be, Joseph's story reminds us that God uses both quiet and courageous acts to reveal His love to the world. If you've ever felt like your role in God's plan is too small to make a difference, Joseph's story offers powerful encouragement. His life reminds us that God often uses quiet, faithful people in extraordinary ways. Today, we'll explore 3 key lessons we can learn from Joseph's life lessons that challenge us to live with faith, courage, and generosity. First, Joseph teaches us what it means to have faith in the shadows. Unlike Peter, James, or John, Joseph wasn't one of Jesus' most visible followers. In fact, John 19:38 tells us that Joseph was a disciple of Jesus secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. Joseph kept his faith quiet, likely because of his position on the Jewish council. Yet despite staying out of the spotlight, Joseph remained devoted. His quiet faith wasn't a sign of weakness, but rather a demonstration of patience and wisdom. Many of us can relate to this. We may not have a platform to preach or lead large groups, but God still calls us to faithful obedience in our everyday lives. Joseph's story shows us that you don't have to be loud to make a difference. You simply need to be faithful where God has placed you. Whether you're serving your family, your workplace, or your church behind the scenes, God sees your quiet faith and is working through it. Second, Joseph's life reveals the courage to stand firm. While Joseph had once kept his faith hidden, the moment Jesus died, everything changed. Mark 15:43 tells us that Joseph boldly went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. This was no small act. By associating himself with Jesus at a time when the disciples had scattered in fear, Joseph risked his reputation, his standing in the Jewish council, and possibly even his safety. Yet in that pivotal moment, Joseph chose to step forward in faith. There are times when God calls us to take a stand, to speak the truth, defend what is right, or identify ourselves as followers of Jesus. These moments often require courage, especially when doing so could cost us something. Joseph's example reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to trust God even when the risks feel overwhelming. Finally, Joseph models generosity and sacrifice. After courageously asking Pilate for Jesus' body, Joseph went a step further. Matthew 27:57-60 tells us that Joseph laid Jesus in his own tomb, a tomb that had been carved out of solid rock, likely at great personal cost. This act wasn't just generous, it was deeply sacrificial. By giving his tomb for Jesus' burial, Joseph gave up something valuable and personal, expecting nothing in return. This kind of selfless giving is central to what it means to follow Jesus. True discipleship often requires us to release what we hold dear, whether that's our time, resources, or comfort, to serve God's purposes. Joseph's act of generosity reminds us that no gift given in Jesus' name is ever wasted. So how can we apply these lessons today? First, embrace your role in God's kingdom, no matter how small it seems. Like Joseph, your quiet faith is powerful. Second, ask God for courage to take a stand when He calls you to. And finally, look for ways to practice sacrificial generosity, trusting that God will use your giving to advance His kingdom. Joseph of Arimathea may not have been a famous preacher or miracle worker, but his quiet faith, bold courage, and generous heart left a lasting impact. His story shows us that true discipleship isn't about being seen, it's about trusting God, standing firm in moments of challenge, and giving selflessly for His glory. Joseph stands as a powerful example of how one quiet act of devotion can change history. While he isn't often the focus of major gospel stories, Joseph played a crucial role in preserving Jesus' body after the crucifixion, an act that not only fulfilled prophecy, but also demonstrated profound discipleship. Today, we're going to explore how Joseph's actions impacted early Christianity and what we can learn from his example. First, let's consider the significance of what Joseph did. After Jesus died on the cross, most of his followers were overwhelmed with fear and grief. The disciples had scattered, and few dared to risk their own safety by claiming Jesus' body. Yet, Joseph of Arimathea stepped forward. Mark 15:43 tells us that Joseph boldly went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. This was no small act, it took courage and conviction. Associating himself with Jesus at that moment carried great risk. The Jewish leaders had just condemned Jesus, and Roman authorities had executed him. By asking for the body, Joseph openly aligned himself with Jesus, even when others kept their distance. More importantly, Joseph's care for Jesus' body fulfilled an ancient prophecy. Isaiah 53:9 foretold that the Messiah would be buried with the rich in his death. Joseph's generosity in offering his own tomb provided the fulfillment of this prophecy. Without Joseph's boldness and compassion, Jesus' body may have been discarded or left to decay, yet Joseph ensured his burial was marked with dignity and care. Joseph's actions also set a profound example of humble discipleship. The Gospels reveal that Joseph had been a follower of Jesus in secret because he feared the Jewish leaders. John 19:38. Yet when the moment of decision arrived, Joseph acted with quiet determination. His faith may have been private before, but when Jesus' followers needed him most, Joseph stepped into the light. This speaks powerfully to those of us who may feel hesitant to share our faith publicly. Joseph's example reminds us that discipleship isn't always loud or attention-seeking. Sometimes it's the quiet, yet courageous acts that leave the greatest impact. Additionally, Joseph's actions inspired others. John 19:39 tells us that Nicodemus, another secret follower of Jesus, joined Joseph in preparing Jesus' body for burial. Joseph's courage encouraged Nicodemus to act boldly as well. This chain reaction illustrates the power of influence. When one person steps out in faith, others often follow. Joseph's devotion not only preserved Jesus' body, but also sparked courage in other believers during a time of fear and uncertainty. Joseph's impact extends beyond the immediate events of Jesus' burial. His story became a powerful testimony in the early church, reminding believers that discipleship isn't defined by status or prominence, but by faith in action. Joseph wasn't one of the 12 apostles, yet his devotion played a vital role in preserving Jesus' legacy. This reminds us that God uses people from all walks of life to fulfill his purposes. Joseph was a wealthy member of the Jewish council, yet he was willing to risk his reputation and resources for Jesus. His story tells us that true discipleship often calls us to step beyond our comfort zones and serve God in unexpected ways. As we reflect on Joseph's impact, we are reminded of the importance of courage, compassion, and quiet faithfulness. Joseph's willingness to care for Jesus' body wasn't just an act of duty. It was an expression of love, honor, and belief in Jesus' mission. His story challenges us to consider how we can live out our faith with that same dedication. So ask yourself, where is God calling you to step forward in faith? Are there quiet acts of service that He's inviting you to embrace? Like Joseph, you may not always see the immediate impact of your actions, but trust that God is working through your faithfulness. As we reflect on Joseph's life, one truth stands out clearly. True discipleship isn't always loud or public. Sometimes the greatest acts of faith are those carried out quietly, yet they leave a lasting impact that echoes through generations. Joseph's role in Jesus' story wasn't defined by bold preaching or miraculous signs. Instead, his faith shone through quiet obedience and courageous action at just the right moment. By stepping forward to request Jesus' body from Pilate, Joseph risked his reputation, his standing in the Jewish council, and possibly his safety. Yet in that pivotal moment, he acted with unwavering conviction. Joseph's willingness to provide his own tomb for Jesus' burial was a powerful display of selfless love. He gave generously, not for recognition, but out of devotion to his Savior. That quiet act fulfilled prophecy and preserved the body of Jesus in preparation for his resurrection. For us today, Joseph's example reminds us that we don't need a platform or public recognition to make a difference. Often, it's the quiet acts of obedience, compassion, and sacrifice that carry the greatest spiritual impact. Whether it's serving behind the scenes, encouraging a struggling friend, or standing firm in our faith when no one else sees, God uses those moments to advance His kingdom. So, as you walk in faith, remember Joseph's example. Trust that God sees your quiet acts of love and obedience, and know that even the smallest step of faith can play a vital role in His greater plan. May we be faithful in the quiet moments, courageous when called to act, and committed to living lives that reflect the heart of a true disciple. Today, I encourage you to reflect on Joseph's example. Ask yourself, am I listening for God's direction? Am I willing to step out in faith when He calls? And am I serving with humility, trusting that God is working even when I'm unseen?